This is completely off topic, but am I the only one who thinks that with the pink hair and like the tattoos, Alana McLaughlin looks like the main villain of Jujutsu Kaisen? Is that just me? And this has nothing to do with, her being transgender or anything. It's everything to do with the hair color and the tattoos. Anyway. Hello everybody, I am not dead yet, and today I am reacting to Greg Doucette's video on Alana McLaughlin, the transgender MMA fighter that recently won her debut. Much like Greg, I received a fair amount of requests to talk about this because, honestly speaking, as someone who lives and dies combat sports, I think it's kind of in my lane. I'm going to use Greg's video as a kind of conduit to talk about the things that I want to say because I really do like his video, and I think there are things that I agree with, disagree with, and things that I can add to it. So without further ado, let's get right into the video.
As you know, I've been highly supportive of the transgender movement, but what is my opinion on this?
See, that's the thing. I want to make sure that people don't conflate me or Greg or even Derek or anybody else not supporting transgender people fighting biological women. And I am going to use the term biological and transgender women to differentiate between the two. I know that can be a little bit of a taboo thing, but I'm going to do that here. I don't want to conflate that with transphobia, because that did happen twice now. Once back when Fallon Fox originally came out as a transgender person and broke someone's skull, and even that's a little bit up for debate. People are saying, oh, broken skull. People think it's like the big thick part of the skull. What ended up happening was she gave her opponent a concussion, fractured her orbital bone, and then she also had multiple staples in her head. So whatever you think, whether saying broken skull is overkill or exaggeration or not. But anyway, back with Fallon Fox was saying that a lot of her detractors are simply transphobic, and the same thing is happening here with Alana McLaughlin. She has said on Twitter, she made a tweet or something, I'll put it up, where she said that transphobes and people that are simply standing against her are only making her blocking hand stronger. That is not what is happening here. I am someone who does support transgender people, and I believe they should be able to transition and do whatever they need to do. However, just because you support someone's ability to transition does not necessarily mean you have to support them in everything they do. That is a big distinction I want to make clear right off the bat.
Before I transitioned, I could bench press over 300 pounds, I could deadlift the back end of a car, run 6-minute miles. Going on HRT, that's hormone replacement therapy, I cannot do those things anymore. Now I'm running like 9-minute miles instead of 6s.
I'm sick and tired of people downplaying the benefit or advantage of being born male.
Yeah, let's talk about the average female versus the average male, because I actually have a story about that. Back when I was 12 years old, I changed boxing clubs, and in this new boxing club that I went to, there was a girl who was pretty well renowned as a good boxer. She had been to Paris and was fully funded and fought there, etc., etc. When I first stepped into the gym, I wasn't as good as her, and she would kind of toy around with me in sparring. Over the course of the next year, however, I eventually caught up to her and surpassed her. This girl was around her mid-20s, and I was 12. It was actually kind of funny because the way she treated me kind of was directly correlated to how good of a boxer I was. At first, I was just a nobody. I wasn't good enough to even be on her radar. She didn't talk to me. Then, when I kind of started to get a little bit better and, kind of matched her, there was a little bit of mutual respect there, and then I got better than her, and then she got kind of salty and stopped talking to me again. But that just goes to show I was better than a woman who was fully funded to fight in Paris in her mid-20s at the age of 12. Now imagine what I'd even be able to do now as I'm entering my mid-20s. Even with the handicap of hormones and surgery, there is just things that will forever stay the same. Because people talk about how the surgery reverses a lot of things. Oh, the bone density, your bones get less dense as you transition. Your hormones crash, so you don't have the increased recovery you used to, etc., etc. You don't have the muscle mass, etc., etc. But even if we assume all of that to be like you take the surgery just takes away all of that, right? Which it doesn't. There's still things like the skeletal structure of a man, which is made to take more hits. The way men are built are just a lot sturdier than women. Fat distribution is another thing. I'm sorry, but you can't surgically make it so that your fat just suddenly distributes differently. If you could, I'm sure a lot of bodybuilders would do it, right? But at the end of the day, there's still a way in which your body distributes fat, and men and women distribute fat differently. And even if we could take away all of that, right? Like, let's just say that, like, you could, through the surgery, move around the skeleton to make it exactly like that of a woman. You could rearrange the fat cells so that they are exactly like that of a woman. You would still have, unless they were willing to slice off parts of their heart and lungs, a bigger heart and a bigger lungs. And what is that increased heart size and increased lung capacity able to do? It allows you to pump more blood to your muscles faster. And the blood that is being pumped to those muscles is going to be more rich in oxygen. What does that mean? It means that it can get more nutrients to the muscles faster, but it also helps in lactic acid buildup and flushing out lactic acid from the muscles. And anybody who has been in a fight before will tell you just how important dealing with lactic acid is in the middle of a fight situation. But even if we take all of that aside, even if we leave all of that, the simple thing of having the bigger heart and bigger lungs increases recovery in between rounds. You have 1 minute to recover in between rounds. And I've trained it. I can go from Coach Greg sprinting, dying on a bike, to relatively back to resting heart rate and breathing within 1 minute. And every single bit of recovery in a fight is important. That bigger heart and increased lung capacity helps you recover faster. As I mentioned, it helps flush out the lactic acid, and that increased nutrient to your muscles helps you get back to baseline. Even the bigger lung capacity allows you to take deeper breaths, which can help you regulate your breathing both in the middle of and in between rounds, which is incredibly important. The importance of breathing in fighting cannot be understated. There are just too many things. Hand size. Let's talk about hand size, because the male hand is way, way bigger than the female hand. I was out shopping for boxing gloves earlier this week, and I came across a pair of actual MMA gloves that specifically say that they design their gloves for the hands of men and women, because the male hand is bigger and wider and the female hand is smaller and more narrow. The bigger, wider, denser boned hand is like you're getting swung with a sledgehammer, which is probably why Fallon Fox was able to fracture her opponent's orbital bone, give her a concussion, and necessitate several staples into her skull. There is a biological difference, and even if we take away the bone density, I highly doubt that these transgender MMA fighters went to have their entire hand reconstructed, because that is literally impossible. Things like thicker wrists. Thicker wrists is a big one, because even if you lose the muscle mass and all that, you still have a thicker wrist. You know what that means? Your wrist is less likely to do this when you hit something. I trained with a coach who, through his years of boxing, had most of the bones in his wrist fused together. So at most he could bend his arm hand like this, like a little bit, which is really inconvenient for everyday life. But when you get hit with that, it hurts like a motherfucker, because it's like you're getting jabbed with a pole. The friggin' arm doesn't bend. And so when you have things like that, Joe Rogan talked about the things like the shoulder joints and the way that men are constructed. We just hit harder, and that there are too many things that you would have to meticulously change in order to make it so that a transgender MMA fighter is on the same level as a biological born female MMA fighter. It's just, at this point, almost impossible. Maybe at some point in the future technology will advance to that point, But at this point, putting a transgender MMA fighter into the ring or octagon against a biological female is reckless and dangerous. And Greg mentions this.
And just because you're not as strong as you used to be, doesn't mean you're not stronger than had you have been born female.
That's another thing, because again, I read up on a few different articles on both Alana McLaughlin as well as Fallon Fox before making this video. And one of the big things that seemed to be repeated in those articles was that comparatively to a man, Fallon Fox did not have the same specs. Fallon Fox was not as strong, didn't have the recovery, etc., etc. But what if we compare her specs and what she can do now as a transgender woman to that of a person who was born a woman, who was a biological woman?
And so you're saying, well, Coach Greg, you're a hypocrite. You're saying you support trans, but you don't support the right to fight against other females.
It's not a right. It's not a right. That's something I want to get clear to a lot of people, because especially when it comes to things like gay and trans issues, you hear the term rights thrown around pretty willy-nilly, and the definition of a right is something that the government cannot take away from you. Fighting is not a right. It is a privilege, much like driving. And this is true even for biological males fighting biological males and biological females fighting biological females. You can be suspended from the UFC. You can get your boxing license revoked. It happens. Fighting is not a right. It is a privilege.
But do I think it's fair to allow transgender females to fight in MMA against people who are born female? No. No, I don't.
And so this whole transgender athlete thing is something that has been around for years, and nothing has really changed because there's no reason to. We are still letting transgender athletes compete against biological women, and I don't think anything is really going to change until something is forced to change. They are seeing that it is working, quote unquote, or at the very least working enough for them to ignore it, and the only way that things will be changed is if something terribly drastic happens that forces a change. And so when we look at all of this, right, what is going to happen, and it is incredibly tragic, but in order for things to change, I truly believe that a woman is going to have to die. And that doesn't mean I want it to happen. In fact, that's why I'm making this video, is because I don't want it to happen. But I believe that nothing is going to happen until a woman either gets seriously injured or dies fighting a transgender fighter. And that is something that I can just see being a massive shit show, because we're going to have people on one end calling people like me, Greg, Derek, transphobes for saying like, listen, like, this is dangerous. We told you something like this would happen. But also I can see actual transphobic people using that as a reason to attack and hate the person that ends up injuring this woman in some way, when this inevitably happens. And because I've seen it happen before. Boxing and MMA is a sport where death is a possibility, and fighting at a professional level means you have to accept the possibility of serious injury or death. And I have a video that I plan to film talking about some of the serious injuries involved in this sport. But I remember a couple years ago where a boxer died in the ring, and so many people really pounced on the killer, and they were saying like, oh, you should have stopped the fight, or you shouldn't have gone so hard on the person, you should have realized that they were hurt, yada yada yada. And here's the thing, is that you are in a fight. Your goal is to end the fight. And so when Greg says I don't blame the transgender individual, neither do I, because if they let them do it, why wouldn't they? The rules are there. The fighters know what they're signing up for. The rules are there to protect the fighters from themselves. And so if and when this tragedy, in my opinion, inevitably happens, it is not the fault of the people who stepped into that ring. It is the fault of the promoters. It is the fault of the organization, the whatever athletic commission sanctioned this fight. It is the responsibility of the people who are outside of the ring or the octagon to keep the people who are inside of the ring or octagon safe. But again, what is the problem with this? Because everybody talks about like, oh, well, you keep bitching, you keep saying, what's the solution? Well, Greg does propose a solution. Here it is.
Make another category so that it's inclusive.
Yeah, so the whole make another category thing, I've actually been saying that for a while, and I often get the counter of, oh, well, that's just drawing attention to their differences. Trans women are women, and it is alienating them. And so my response to that is always, does the Paralympics alienate people with physical disabilities? Does the Special Olympics alienate people with mental disabilities? No, it allows people to shine in situations where they otherwise wouldn't have. But my big issue with giving transgender people their own category is that I don't think it's going to happen, specifically because I don't think there's enough transgender people to justify their own category. These things cost a lot of money, obviously. And I mean, creating a whole new category for one or two people, maybe people can justify that. I'm not entirely sure what the actual politics and kind of organization that goes into creating a new category in things like the UFC or boxing or whatever. But the way I see it is, it's just like, why would we create a whole new category for simply two people to fight each other? And the reason why I say two people specifically is because we only really have two examples of transgender fighters in recent history, Fallon Fox, who is retired as of 2014, and now Alana McLaughlin. So it's like, I understand wanting to give transgender people their own category, and I would be fully supportive of it if there was enough people to justify it. The issue is that transgender people make up less than 1% of the US population. I think the statistic is 0.6. And so it's like, how many of them have the means to actively fully transition? And of those people who can actively fully transition, how many of them want to be professional MMA, UFC fighters, boxers, whatever? It's just, as you go down the list of requirements, it becomes a very specific type of person. And that's the issue here. And I understand the whole no person left behind mentality. I, at my core, am an individualist. It's a really tough situation to be in. I can't really give an answer because as I'm someone who likes to look, once an answer is proposed or an idea is proposed, I like to look at the plausibility of it. And as much as a full-blown transgender division would be perfectly fine by me, and I think is a great solution, I wonder how many do we have enough people to actively fill up that division? Oh, and one more thing, because a lot of people will be talking about, because I talk a lot about, I've had this conversation a lot over the years, especially when it came to the weightlifting thing, because again, my sport, people die. But people say like, oh, well, if you deny their identity, then it's going to cause a ton of mental health issues. First off, there's a lot of mental health issues tied to transitioning, and this isn't me being transphobic, it's just me looking at the statistics. Transgender people have on average a 45% suicide rate, which is abnormally high. I think it's 40% in supportive environments. I think it can go down to around, at the very lowest, 35%, and then around 50% in non-supportive environments, which again is absolutely ludicrous. And so when people say, oh, you're going to negatively affect their mental health by denying their identity, by forcing them to fight in their own division, I say, well, what happens when something bad happens, someone gets seriously hurt or killed, and then everybody's calling the trans person a murderer? I mean, they're already getting called a cheater, sickos, and everything else. What happens when someone actually finally dies, and then a bunch of people start throwing in things like murderer into the mix? That cannot be good for someone who's already got dealing with a lot of mental issues. And again, I'm not trying to be transphobic or mean. I'm just looking at the reality of the situation. But those are just my thoughts for this video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Before I sign off, I would like to thank my Patreon supporters, them being Trudy Dyke, Daniel Barrios, Tom Lazoric, and Justin Hightower. If you would like to become a patron, check out my links in the description, along with my PayPal and affiliate links. But until next time, remember, only the strong subscribe. I'm not dead yet, and if you are not either, there is always a tomorrow waiting for you.